Protecting your privacy. Points of vulnerability. Hi everyone, Leo Notenboom here for askleo.com. Privacy and security are things that we talk about a lot, and it seems like their importance has only been increasing over the years. However, even though that on the surface they seem like very simple concepts, there are so many different places that either or both can be compromised, especially your privacy, that I think it's worth understanding all the different points along the path that you might be taking between yourself and your correspondence or your services that you're using to understand where things might be compromised and where your privacy might be at risk and what you might want to do about it. We'll start with your computer. Naturally, you're trusting the software that's on your machine. You trust that privacy and security decisions have been made properly for each piece of software you're using. And that's true for the operating system, whatever operating system you're running, for all of the applications you install, for all of the apps that you install on your phone, for everything that's running on your machine. The operating system itself, be it Windows or Linux or Mac, yes, you're assuming that they've made the proper decisions. Also, you're assuming that the decisions they've made reflect what it is you want in terms of privacy. There are those who disagree strongly with some of the decisions that Microsoft and Apple have made with respect to privacy. There are some who don't care. There are others who are absolutely convinced that Linux is the only way to remain private. What matters here is that you understand that there's a choice to be made and that privacy is in fact part of the choice you're making, part of what factors into the choice you're making when you decide which operating system to use. Every operating system vendor has the power to change what they're doing without telling you. They may be required to, there may be laws. What doesn't mean that they're following the letter of the law. It doesn't mean that they may not be skirting the issue. It doesn't mean that there may not be changes. Sometimes there are, and you just never know. Be aware. The same thing goes even more for applications, because applications come from so many different vendors. Every piece of software on your machine has the opportunity to compromise your privacy. What that means is you need to be aware and don't install things you don't need, and only download and install software you trust from vendors you trust. Now, of course, when we talk about privacy and security, the very first thing that comes to mind is malware. But we already kind of know how to deal with malware, right? We know how to avoid it, and we know how to scan for it. There are tools you can run on your machine, and you should in fact be running, that are scanning and preventing malicious software from arriving or running on your machine. Like I said, we know how to do that. This doesn't mean you should let your guard down, but it does mean that there are also other places to at least be aware. There are no tools to scan all of your installed software to see if they're handling your privacy correctly. There are no tools to scan your operating system to make sure it's handling your privacy correctly. So next, hardware. One of the things that I've said frequently is that if it's not physically secure, it's not secure. And that's one of the things that is very easy to overlook. Physical access, the ability for someone to walk up to your machine and start using it, is a complete violation of privacy if you don't understand or if you don't trust the persons that have that kind of access. If there are people around that you would not want to access your computer, and yet they could, you need to take steps. It could be as simple as locking your machine. It could be as simple as turning your machine off. It could be as simple as whole disk encryption, or it could be as complex as putting it in a room that has a lock. It depends on your situation. It is very important to understand that anybody who can walk up to your machine can basically do whatever they want with it. Hardware compromise is something that is rare at home, but something that you do need to be aware of if you ever end up using public computers. For example, the canonical example of this is a hardware-based keylogger being installed on a public computer. It's not something that would be detected by software. It's not something that you would know to look for. It's not something that you may even realize what it is if you do see it. But the bottom line is it is possible to add a piece of hardware between the keyboard and the computer that then records everything that's being typed. Hardware compromise is something that you need to be aware of, that it's possible, and make sure you're taking the appropriate steps to avoid. What are those appropriate steps? Well, honestly, don't use public computers. Don't use computers you can't completely trust. That's pretty simple. So your network is the next level of thing that I want to talk about because your network is another point of potential compromise. The biggest target, especially of late, is your router. That's the device that connects all of your machines to the internet. If a router gets compromised, it doesn't matter how secure those individual machines are. Compromising that router can cause those machines to go to websites that they didn't expect to go to. They can cause those machines to download things that shouldn't be downloaded. They can cause all sorts of havoc. So one of the most important things you need to realize is that if you can compromise a router, you can compromise every machine connected to it. How you secure that? Make sure that your router's firmware is up to date. Make sure that you've got your own unique administration password on the router. Now, when it comes to wireless connections, which is something that people often think of in conjunction with routers, you need to make sure that your wireless setup is secure. An open hotspot, a Wi-Fi connection that does not require a password, is not secure. If you need to or want to provide something like that, make sure it's on what might be a guest network as provided by your router. But if you don't have that as an option, make sure to put a password on your wireless connections. That'd be a WPA2 or WPA3 password to encrypt and secure the connection. That means only people that know the password can connect, and everybody that's connected is safe from somebody in range being able to snoop, much like an open wireless hotspot at a cafe. Now, the router protects you basically from internet-based threats. That's when we talk about the compromise of a router. It's usually coming in from the internet or some way of somebody remotely trying to hack or gain control of your router. What if the threat's more local? What if it's another machine on your network that's been compromised? Children are the, again, canonical example of scenarios where you might need to take some extra steps. They don't necessarily know all of the things that they should do, and even when they do, they may not always be able to resist the temptation to bypass some of those things. You may find yourself in a situation where you need to protect yourself from your children's computers. That means you may need to assign them a different network, assign them that guest network that your router may provide. It may mean that you need to install a separate additional router, but it's another point of vulnerability that you need to be aware of. And of course, other devices. Lord knows there are more non-computer devices connected to my network right now than there are actual computers. And I have several computers. That's another point of potential compromise. Now, the good news here is that rarely are those devices, the so-called Internet of Things, used to compromise other machines or other equipment on your local network. More often than not, they are used to cause havoc elsewhere on the internet. They become participants in DDoS attacks or botnets or something else. But nonetheless, this is not something you want to overlook. It turns out that security and privacy weren't really at the top of many IoT vendors' lists. So it's something else to be aware of, and another opportunity potentially for a separate network so that you can both separate those threats from your important devices and potentially be able to understand when those things are causing issues. Number 3 on my hit list, your ISP. Remember, your ISP can see everything you do. If you're not encrypting your data, I'll talk more about that in a second, your ISP can see who you're connecting to, what data you're exchanging with whoever it is you're connecting to, the services you use. They can get a lot of information about you and your computer and your communications. Now, most of the time, they're not going to care. They really don't. They've got more important things to do than snoop on what you're doing. Except if you're in, I'll just say, certain countries that may have more paranoid, more controlling governments where they actually do end up snooping on what it is you're doing. So there are three things that all really boil down to encryption of some sort that I would recommend you at least, again, understand whether or not you are in a situation where these are necessary. HTTPS is one you're probably already familiar with. This secures your connection between your browser and the website you're visiting. For example, HTTPS is used by askleo. What that means is that your ISP can see that you're connecting to askleo because that initial request is not hidden. But the actual data that's transferred between your browser and askleo is encrypted. They cannot see, your ISP cannot see the questions you're asking or the pages that you're viewing. All they can see is that you're having a conversation with askleo. The same is true for your bank, for your medical records, for any other website that's using HTTPS. And most websites, especially websites that contain sensitive data, should be doing that already. A VPN takes your ISP even further out of the loop. HTTPS is only about your web browser, and it's only about HTTPS connections. Everything else, regular HTTP connections, and all the other services that you might be running on your machine, like say Dropbox or OneDrive, or who knows what else is running on your machine, the fact that you're using all of those services is also apparent to your ISP, unless you're using a VPN. A VPN hides everything, with one exception. Your ISP can tell that you're using a VPN. They can tell which VPN you're using. They cannot tell which websites you're visiting, which services you're using, anything. Now, there is a huge caveat with using a VPN. In a very real sense, your VPN becomes your ISP because they are providing that final leg to the rest of the internet. So your VPN provider can see which websites you're visiting, which services you're using, and so on. Finally, there's Tor, the onion router. This, again, hides everything from your ISP. Your ISP can see only that you're using Tor. They cannot see what you're doing. However, on the receiving end, with all of the previous examples, VPNs, HTTP, HTTPS, the provider you're using can see where you're coming from, what your IP address is, what it is you're asking for. With Tor, that gets further obfuscated so that even the receiving end can't tell where you are or where you're located or your IP address. They can still see what you're doing because you're making requests of some remote service. They can see those, otherwise it wouldn't make sense to actually use the service. But the actual transmission of data does not expose any of that information. Only what you do does. And finally, of course, if you log into a service, by definition, they know who you are. All the encryption in the world isn't going to prevent a service from knowing who you are if you tell them who you are. And that's exactly what logging in does. Now, in that same vein, a work internet connection also exposes you to perhaps an even greater risk of privacy issues. And that is because it's generally quite accepted for employer-provided equipment to include monitoring software or even monitoring hardware. It is quite possible, quite accepted, if the employer is providing your internet for them to be able to monitor everything you do. And that actually may include being able to intercept HTTPS connections. Again, you're using their internet connection. They have the ability and generally the right to monitor how you're using it. When you're at your place of employment, even your own personal device may fall into this category where it's totally acceptable for your employer to monitor what you're up to if you're using their internet connection. The steps here are actually pretty simple. Don't do anything using work equipment or internet that you wouldn't want your employer to see. And if there are things you don't want your employer to see, do it on your own time, with your own internet connection and your own equipment. Of course, coffee shops and other public locations are something that we think about often when it comes to privacy. And that's because open Wi-Fi is fairly easy to snoop on. However, it's also fairly easy to protect yourself. I've got an article on that on how to stay safe with open Wi-Fi. That's something that, especially if you're a traveler, I recommend you take a look at and make sure that you're doing all the right things to keep yourself safe. Finally, another scenario that I hear from time to time are what I will call shared connections. You are using, with or without their permission, the internet connection belonging to a neighbor, or the internet connection provided by the friends and family you're visiting, or the internet connection provided by your landlord, and many other scenarios. Realize that in each one of those cases, these people are your ISP. By definition, internet service provider, these people are providing your internet service. They can do all of the things that I've been talking about. And if you trust them, great, it's not an issue. If you don't trust them, then you'll want to take many of the steps that I've been talking about so far. Fourth on my hit list, the online services themselves. Let's face it, when we talk about privacy, it's very easy to talk about things like social media, Facebook, posting too much, data breaches where your information gets discovered by hackers who have made their way into the various services that you may be using. There's not a lot you can really do about that, with the exception of making sure you're using services that have a track record of being trustworthy, reputable services that you know they're doing the right thing, and that, like I said, you trust. It also means you want to make sure you're not oversharing. That's probably one of the biggest privacy breaches that a lot of people just don't understand. So often we share so much about ourselves that we don't realize how much of a picture we're painting about ourselves on the internet. Think twice whenever you share something, especially on social media. Email is one of those things that is incredibly important. It's a lifeline for many, but because it is so old, it's not particularly private. In other words, if I send an email message to someone, anyone, there's a good chance that any email server that's involved in getting the message from point A to point B could potentially take a look at my message. There is no default encryption in email. If you need to send something that you must make sure is never seen by prying eyes, use encryption. Or don't use email. Use one of the other potentially encrypted messaging services or any of another of alternatives. There are solutions for encrypted email, and I do have articles on the topic, but it is not on by default, and it definitely takes some additional steps on your part. Cloud storage, another opportunity for things to go wrong. Cloud storage is awesome. Don't get me wrong. I love and rely on OneDrive and Google Drive and Dropbox and services like that. But you do need to be aware that you're putting your information on somebody else's computer. You're trusting them not to peek. If you're putting stuff in the cloud that is sensitive in any way, shape, or form, then you'll want to make sure that it is somehow encrypted, or you don't want to put it on cloud at all. Now, there are lots of good solutions for encryption. I happen to use Boxcryptor myself. I have fairly sensitive data stored in the cloud, but securely encrypted using that third-party tool. And indeed, yes, that does mean I trust that third-party tool. Let's talk about other online services like professional services. Personally, I find online banking incredibly useful. Don't get me wrong. I love it. I use it all the time. But based on a lot of the questions I get, some financial providers haven't caught up. Some financial providers are still doing things in ways that I would consider to be fundamentally insecure or security averse, right? In the name of essentially covering their own behinds, they put rules and regulations into place that actually make security harder for their customers. Some examples of things that I would look for in an online service provider, be it banking or medical or investing or anything like that, would include things like arbitrary length passwords, including spaces. I'm shocked at the number of services that still limit your password to 8 characters. That's not secure. I would not use such a service. The availability of two-factor authentication. Absolutely look for that. That is incredibly important. And if a service basically automatically sends you a text message to confirm that it's you the first time you use a new computer, that is, by definition, two-factor authentication. That's great. Not all services have it. I recommend for the very important accounts like your finances, you make sure that that's an option. Telephone support. And by telephone support, I mean telephone support that gets you to a real person who speaks your language, who you can understand and they can understand you, and you can get your problem solved. I don't care where they are. I honestly don't care where they are. As long as you can understand one another and as long as they can deal with the issues you're bringing to them, that's great. That's often where telephone support falls down. And so many companies now are pushing to phone trees and to automated solutions and to online solutions that it can be very frustrating if you're facing a problem and none of those solutions help. It can be very frustrating unless the service you're using actually has real human online support. With finances specifically, I love real-time transaction alerts. Every time my credit card gets used, I get a notification. I recommend you do the same. And of course, HTTPS and only HTTPS will do when it comes to these types of services. Much of this is also in your control. When it comes to account security, it is important that you do the basics. Use appropriate passwords. Manage those passwords appropriately so that you can keep them secure and private and unique. Set up the account recovery information for each of those accounts and don't let it expire. And of course, use two-factor authentication whenever it's offered. The last item on my list here is, I think, something that surprises a lot of people, not because they disagree, but because it's something that we just don't think about. And that is the other guy, the family, the friends, the acquaintances that you're communicating with. Remember, when you communicate with someone, you send them a sensitive email. You are now assuming that all of their security is good, that they've done all the right things, that their machine hasn't been hacked, or in the worst case, that they themselves are not doing something malicious with whatever it is you say. Very often, the person at the other end of whatever it is you're doing, be it chatting, be it email, be it video, be it whatever you're sharing with that other individual, they can sometimes be your biggest risk. Keep that in mind. I'm not saying don't communicate with people. We have to. And I'm not saying that everybody's untrustworthy. By and large, they are. But be aware, especially when you're sharing sensitive information, you are relying on not just their trustworthiness, but to some degree, their ability to use their technology in a secure way. As you know, as you've seen, that can be difficult. That can be not obvious, and not everybody may be up to the task. What that means for you is that rather than relying on the technology that they may not have done securely, you may instead want to choose something more mundane, an in-person conversation, an old-style phone call, whatever. But the point being that make sure you understand that it's not just you that's involved in a conversation, that security needs to be appropriate at both ends if you want to make sure that security and privacy are maintained. I hope that was helpful. It was a long video, a lot of different things to consider, but privacy is, as you can see, a very complicated and very important thing we need to keep in mind. For updates, for related links, for comments and more, visit askleo.com/25709. I'm Leo Notenboom. This is askleo.com. Thanks for watching.